In today's video, we're going to talk about the different edge-to-edge tools under the edge-to-edge icon in your Mach 3 software. And we'll be kind of working our way down the toolbox over here as I talk about different patterns. But before I do that, I want to review a few things about how patterns are designed and how they're used. There is a document on my website on this that's pretty in-depth and shows a lot of different illustrations of them, but I'm going to talk about just a couple of those here. So we've got several different pattern types here in my pattern pad. One is a block pattern. So the start and end are here in the middle. And so this would not work as an edge-to-edge pattern clearly because it wouldn't be able to finish the one pattern and start on the next. So this is basically a closed circle. And so that won't work in this function. Go ahead and delete that. The next is just a regular edge-to-edge pattern. It starts on the left, ends on the right. That's kind of part of the criteria for people who are designing for robotic quilting systems. And this one would be considered not only an edge-to-edge, but also a border-to-border because it would fit cleanly inside, say, outer borders if I had them. So all border-to-borders are edge-to-edge patterns, but not all edge-to-edge patterns are border-to-border. So to show you that, I'll pull this one on. Again, it starts on the left, ends on the right, but if I try to put that inside of two edges, it's not going to fit. There's going to be gaps on it. So this would not be considered a border-to-border pattern. It is considered an edge-to-edge, and I'll show how to set those up using some different tools. There's patterns like this. Let's blow this up a little bit. That are also considered edge-to-edge, and briefly, I want to mention that these kind of patterns can also be used as auto fits. They start on the left, end on the right, same horizontal plane, and we'll go into how to set up auto fit patterns in a later video. So finally, I want to bring this one on. This is a pattern that deeply nests, and I'm going to show you how to set this up as we go through the project. So you have to use a negative vertical spacing to get it to really lock in together. Otherwise, you'd have these sort of crazy gaps. So let's get started with the edge-to-edge tool. Okay, we'll just start at the top of the icon. So when you open edge-to-edge, this is the dialog box that comes up. And we'll talk about more or less repeats. So those are most frequently used when you're setting up a border. So I'm going to bring on the lounge lizards, which I think are pretty hilarious. And I'm going to say, I'm going to leave them connected, so I'm not going to check the not connected box. And I'm going to say more. And it's just going to start attaching them, and they will be connected and so continuously. If I want to take one off, I can just pull one off by saying less. And so this is a way that you could set up a border if you've created outlines on it. I will also cover this in border corner video at a later time. So that's just briefly about what that icon does. Now going down to the next section on edge to edge, this is going to be what you use most commonly as you're setting up projects. The first option is fit. And so let's pull this onto here. This is considered a edge to edge, but it's not considered border to border because there would be gaps around the quilt on it. But I want to use these circles to kind of illustrate a point. So if I use the fit icon, and I've got this sort of squarish pattern and a rectangular quilt, it can cause it to distort. So I'm going to say fit and generate edge to edge. And it's not too bad given the ratio of this quilt, but on some patterns it will distort it pretty badly. There's also these gaps that probably wouldn't be very suitable on a customer quilt. So that wouldn't be the best thing to use for this. Let me pull up another one for a pattern like this, which is a border-to-border pattern. That function of fit might be great, so we'll click on that. But you can see on here how it did distort those a little bit, it pulled them sideways. So you just have to sort of use your best judgment when you're setting these up. I do want to say that if you have a customer come in that wants to do a self-bound quilt, meaning they're binding with the backing, that you would want to use the fit option because you would not want your quilting to run off the edge of the quilt into what they're going to pull around and have be binding. So you want to clarify that in your intake process. We always try to discourage that because it's not the best thing to do for a quilt anyway. So let's go to the next option, which is trim. So let's explore the trim function a little bit. So if I bring on one of these patterns that is not a border to border pattern and choose trim and go down and say generate edge to edge, it's going to split the patterns off the edge in the top and the bottom, which is great, so you don't have any of those gaps that are created by this pattern type. On this particular pattern, I also like to run a little bit of a negative row gap. So I'm going to say, just put the negative sign and overlap those so it looks more consistent. You don't have kind of gaps between the rows. So that's a great option on things. You can sometimes get this line in here, and I will talk in the next video about how to remove that, how you can sort of have an alternative to troubleshoot that. But for now, this is how it's going to look. So you want to be really careful you put the quilt in properly, the measurements of the quilt in properly, and that you check with your crosshairs on your machine that the patterns go to the edge of the quilt. Because once I accept this, you can see that I did have the machine set up to draw a line between those shapes. So you wouldn't want this vertical line inside the binding on the customer quilt. So you want to just use your crosshairs or your push pins to confirm that that's not going to appear there. Let's talk a little bit about these other choices that are under the edge-to-edge option, including the row gap and offset. So if we go ahead and generate a fit pattern, you'll see that the only thing on here now that I can change is the row gap. So let's go ahead and do that. Oops, I have to have the pattern selected. Generate edge to edge. So when it generates an edge to edge, it connects the patterns automatically. And so you can't really increase a column gap, which would increase the space between them because they would no longer be connected. So that, as far as I can tell, is always grayed out. But I could increase the distance between the rows by clicking the plus or putting in a number, and it's going to separate those rows or to bring them closer together and even overlap them if I want to. So there's times where that's very useful, and I'm going to show you that in just a second. So this is a great pattern by Patricia Ritter called Seafoam that I'm going to use to demonstrate another option under trim. So I've got the pattern selected, and I'm going to go ahead and generate it. This pattern needs to be nested clearly, so you can see how big the gaps are on it. And there's a couple different ways to do that, but I like to use just the row gap option and just keep clicking it, and you can see that this has to nest. I'm going to have to keep going because right now those are overlapping. So you can see how far you have to put that in to get those circles to not touch or overlap. So that would be a good amount. So it's 5 3/4 inch. Of course, that's going to vary depending on the scale of the pattern that you start with. But it's a fun pattern, great for kind of underwater stuff. We've used it a lot. So I'm going to say update and accept. So I'll show another trick that you can use in the edge-to-edge function. We'll take our lizards here again and generate an edge-to-edge using trim, so their tails are cut off over here. You can, on some patterns, go ahead and just grab one row and bring it up to where you want it, and it will adjust the rows, but that doesn't always work like I'm anticipating. So let me go ahead and say cancel here. Let me pull another pattern on here. This one is one of ours off our website. We'll say generate. And it does need to overlap. It needs to have that same negative spacing. But sometimes if you pull it up and do that, it can go kind of crazy. So it's behaving at the moment, but let's see. It can get kind of goofy. So it's easier just to use your negative row gap to have better control over that. So this is a fun pattern that comes with your machine. Let's go ahead and use it with, I'm going to leave it on trim and generate edge to edge. And so you can kind of see how that lines up. There's some vertical lines here that would end up matching. But what we want to do is offset each row. So I'm going to click here at 50%, which is going to be exactly what I want, and say update, and it offset them. So now I can apply this negative number to the row gap and bring them down to where they're touching right here like a traditional clamshell would do. So great, great option for you that is pretty automated, and it trims it and it would look great on a quilt. Let's go back to our lounge lizards for a second, and I'm going to generate an edge to edge. And I'm not going to bother decreasing the row gap at the moment, but what I would like to play with is this flip. And so I would like to flip every other row on a vertical axis. So let's try that and see what it does. So you can see now they're going two different directions. And then I can come in and adjust the row gap to tighten them up. And they're a little close there. I could increase that, but then I can also come down to the offset in this situation. I don't necessarily want a 50% offset, but I might want a little bit of one, so I can just click the buttons until those feet kind of alter and go fill up those blank spaces. So let's just keep trying this. That's too much. So you can keep playing around with it until you can get exactly the look that you want on your quilt. Moving down the menu, one of the last items here is the variants. And where I see this being used is if you had borders and you wanted to quilt inside those borders. So let's say we've got 10-inch borders on the quilt total. I could come in and change this to 50 and this to 62. And you can see that it will adjust those patterns. So it would be a way to have your total quilt measurement plus the space that's inside the borders. Okay, we kind of skipped over a couple of the options under type up here. So let's talk about multiply next. So I have put a pattern on here that is not an edge to edge, it's a block pattern. And I'm going to use the multiply function to space it because I want to, say, do a bunch of blocks on a quilt and have them be really evenly placed. And so I'm going to come down here to across and I'll choose 5, and here I'll choose 6. And say generate, and it's going to put those together, and then I could come in and do a 2-inch gap on both the column and the row gap, which previously the column gap had been grayed out, so I could get those spaced very evenly. Remember, I have different measurements that I've popped in here in terms of having the borders, so but you could go ahead then and use your transform tool and place them and get them centered to do whatever you want to do with it. I want to make one other comment about multiply. It's tempting to think that that's very similar to using more or less repeats, but I want you to see that when I do use it, let's go ahead and say 5 and 6 here, and generate an edge to edge, that it's going to stop sewing between every single repeat. You can go in and they're grouped, and so if I ungroup it and then go and use the function to link them, you can get rid of those starts and stops. But what I've learned is that if I make any other changes after I link them, sometimes it breaks it apart when you go to send it again. And so you have all these starts and stops, which is just a total annoyance. So I'd recommend that whenever you need to do a row or a border, use the add more that's at the top of the toolbox. Okay, the last option that I want to show on here is the fill option. If I pull this one pattern over here and leave it set at 1 and 0 and say generate, it's going to take that pattern and fill up the entire quilt, which I can't imagine you would ever use. I'm going to Control Z out of that, and then go ahead and come in and say 5 and 6. And this is a way that I can really control filling the quilt without too much distortion. So if I say generate edge to edge now, you can see that that actually filled the measurements of the quilt that I had in place before. So that would be how you would use that fill option. As you can see, there are some very powerful options in edge to edge, so it makes it easy for us to do a great job on customer quilts with all the different things that Innova has given us. Um, let's play around with this one last simple pattern to just demonstrate some of what we learned, and I'd be curious to see how you're using it. So I'm going to say leave it at trim, generate edge to edge. Oh, I have to have the pattern selected, and then decrease my row gap. So this would look great on a quilt, but I can also then start playing with the offsets and get a completely different look to it. So get in there and goof around with each of the tools and see what you can come up with, and provide any feedback to us that you might have on this video or any of our other videos. Thanks for watching.